Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues. Today, we continue our series of conversations looking at the issue of redistricting in the state of Wisconsin. As we know, census numbers will be released in the coming months, and with that comes the redrawing of legislative and congressional maps. And as we also know, the last time the maps were drawn, back in 2011, it was quite controversial. And in fact, it has been the subject of litigation. Today, we will be talking about what happened then, the impact it had on Wisconsin politics, and what happens next in the redistricting process this time around. Later, we'll be hearing from the Lubar Center's research fellow, John Johnson, who's been taking a look at the maps and the numbers and looking at how a change in maps might affect the outcome, for example, of assembly races. But first, let's talk with the Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Our friend Craig Gilbert joins us now from Washington. Craig, it's great to have you on the program today. And let's talk a little bit about how redistricting works. As we said, it happens every 10 years. We have new census numbers coming out. Give us kind of the bottom line here. How does this actually happen in Wisconsin?
Well, the clock starts ticking when we get the actual census data, which would normally happen this spring, but looks like it's not going to happen until the beginning of August, if not later. And then, what normally happens is the localities kind of draw new ward lines. Wards are the building blocks for census for redistricting. And then eventually the state legislature draws a congressional district map and a legislative district map. And that's a piece of legislation that gets passed by the Assembly and the Senate and is either vetoed by the governor or signed by the governor. In all recent cycles, except for the last one, that process has ended up in the courts. But in 2011, Republicans had control of the governor's office as well as the legislature, and they were able to pass a map which, as I'm sure we'll talk about, was very favorable to the Republican Party. There were court challenges, but they failed in the end. And most people think it's going to end up in the courts this time.
Let's talk about the criteria that are used, Craig, for drawing the maps. They're fairly specifically referenced, are they not?
Yeah, I mean, there's federal law that applies here, and there's also state law. But basically, like you've got 99 assembly districts in Wisconsin. They have to be equal in population, not perfectly equal, but as equal as reasonably they can be drawn. And the state law requires them to be as compact as possible, and also to sort of observe, ward lines and municipal lines to the extent possible. Beyond that, the map drawers have a fair amount of leeway. They can't violate, the voting rights of minorities, and that's one source of litigation over these maps, but they also do have some freedom legally now to do partisan gerrymandering. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in the last few years that a map, they declined to sort of constitutionally reject maps on grounds of partisan gerrymandering. So that is still a ripe area, and will be in this next round of redistricting.
The drawing of the maps, this has become very sophisticated business, has it not?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with, computing power and the level of sophistication we have now about demographics and voting patterns and voting behavior, you can, if you set out, for example, to achieve the maximum partisan advantage in a map, you can do that. You can be brutally efficient in that based on all the data available and everything we know. Now, it also means that it's a lot easier than it was in the past to, for people on the outside to quantify that, to measure that, to evaluate that. So there's a little bit of transparency there at the back end, but certainly, the ability to kind of micro map these districts and get them exactly how you want them, because we know how people vote and we know that Democrats and Republicans aren't randomly distributed across the state.
We have mentioned, Craig, that the last redistricting obviously was done in 2011, and you referenced the fact that was a time where Republicans had swept into power. They controlled the governor's mansion, the assembly, the Senate. They drew the maps. They passed the maps. When we look back on it, how important a moment was that in modern day Wisconsin politics?
It was a tremendously important moment because if you remember, that election was that, 2011, the maps were drawn. In 2012, President Obama won re-election fairly handily in Wisconsin. He won statewide by 7 points. So statewide, there were more Democratic voters than Republican voters. But under the new maps that were drawn, Republicans kind of easily maintained their control of both legislative chambers. And then in all the ensuing elections since then, which were more competitive at the statewide level, they were able to establish even bigger majorities. So if you think about all the policy legacies under Governor Scott Walker and this Republican legislature, which is not only a matter of Republican control of the legislature, but large margins of control in the legislature, the maps had a big impact on that. They aren't entirely responsible for the Republican advantage, as I'm sure we'll talk about later, because there is a inherent Republican advantage in the way in the residential patterns among Republicans and Democrats, but they magnified that advantage quite significantly.
Democrats and some good government groups, I guess you could say, cried foul after 2011. They said this was a radical gerrymander. What specifically were the Democrats most upset about, Craig?
Well, you talked about the ability with technology to sort of maximize the advantage of one party. So if you look at, recent elections, we've seen that, typically, if you take the 99 assembly districts, more than 60 of them are more Republican than the state as a whole, are consistently won at the top of the ticket in statewide elections by the Republican candidate, and are won at the legislative level by the Republican candidate for assembly. So, 62, 63 inherently Republican districts out of 99, that leaves 37 for the Democrats. That's a kind of an innate 25-seat advantage that's kind of baked into this process for Republicans. So all things being equal, Republicans, in a 50-50 election can expect to have a majority margin of 25 seats in the 99-seat assembly. So that also means that even in good election cycles for Democrats, their chances of ever kind of winning control of the assembly are quite poor.
And Republicans' response centers, I would guess, on this political geography matter, that this is just the way the state looks. People who are like-minded often live near each other, and there's not a lot that we can do to change that.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two arguments that I've heard from Republicans about this, or two defenses. And one is just, hey, elections have consequences. Those are the breaks. It's a political process. We can do this. We did this. And that's one argument. It's not an argument for fairness, but it's an argument for power. The other argument, as you said, is that this reflects the political geography of the state. And it is important to note that there is, because of the way Democrats are clustered in cities, especially Milwaukee and Madison, even in a theoretically fair map, Democrats would be at a disadvantage. But no matter how you measure this, and every kind of fair analysis will tell you that natural advantage has been greatly magnified by the way the maps were drawn. I mean, just as a rule of thumb, under the previous plan, I think the Republicans had a kind of baked-in advantage of maybe 10 or 12 seat margin in the assembly, and that's been sort of doubled under the current map to about 25.
Let's talk for a moment, Craig, about the litigation that has ensued since the drawing of the maps in 2011. The case that I think probably got the most attention and advanced the furthest through the legal system was the Gill versus Whitford case. Help remind people of what the crux of that case was. Something called the efficiency gap came up, became a popular part of our political jargon. Tell us about that case.
Yeah, so there's lots of ways to try to quantify, gerrymandering effects, and they were all brought into play in the litigation. But the efficiency gap sort of goes to the question of, a concept known as wasted votes. And if you think about, having districts, for example, in Milwaukee that are 80 or 90% Democratic, and all of those votes are quite valuable in statewide elections. But in district elections, you don't need 90% to win. You need 51% to win. So everything above 50% is kind of a wasted vote in a district level election. Whereas, if you have a lot of 55% or 60% majority Republican districts, that's kind of a more efficient way to win elections at the district level, because you don't have as many unnecessary votes in those districts. So you can measure this, and when this has been measured with respect to the current Wisconsin map, you find a pretty extreme advantage for Republicans in terms of the number of wasted Democratic votes. And you also find that, if you randomly try to make variations or make changes in the current map, almost every change you could make would make it better for Democrats, which means the Republicans got the most they could possibly get out of this map.
There were a number of people in the Democratic Party who were optimistic about what might happen ultimately with this case, that it would get to the Supreme Court, that the court might rule in the favor of those challenging the redistricting that was done in 2011. What did the court do in that case?
Well, there were some victories, obviously, at lower levels in the federal courts, in terms of the challenges to this plan. But ultimately, that was all sort of overtaken by the Supreme Court's decision that, again, partisan advantage in and of itself was not a basis for rejecting a map, that it was sort of beyond the scope of the courts. And so that kind of set the current parameters, legal parameters, for the world we're living in now, which is that, you can create a gerrymandered map, and that isn't enough in and of itself to make it unconstitutional.
So Democrats have somewhat limited options in terms of how they respond to what happened in 2011, or how they can move forward. One of them is something that the governor announced last year, and he created something called the Wisconsin Fair Maps Commission. For people who are not familiar with this, it's an organization that has been holding public hearings, virtual public hearings, over the last few months. Who are the folks who sit on that commission, and what are they supposed to do at the end of their work?
Well, I think they're supposed to create, fair maps. That's their mission. But it's kind of an advisory mission. I mean, the state law is still tells us that the legislature enacts the maps, and so we're still going to find ourselves in a situation where the Republican-controlled legislature will create a map that we expect to be favorable to Republicans. We would expect the governor to veto that map. And then, we're kind of in uncharted territory with respect to, the litigation, whether it's going to be up to the state courts, whether it's going to be up to the federal courts, and how the courts are going to deal with this. Even though the Supreme Court has said you can have a gerrymandered map, if there's a conflict between the governor and the legislature over this legislation, the final product is going to have to go through the courts. And, the commission the governor created, could be a reference point for the litigation. But it'll be the courts that, ratify the final map.
So the hope that the governor would have, and some others would have, that these maps that are drawn up by the commission could be an alternative, for example, for a court to consider as it goes about making a final determination.
Sure.
Yeah. So Craig, again, you said probably not until August 1st. How does the legislature do this quickly? Because they will be expected to do it fairly quickly. Are they confident that they can get this done, given the fact that we've seen a delay in the release of the census numbers?
Yeah, I think what will happen, what I would expect to happen, is that, the legislature will, do a lot of, informal work on this. we have data on population. It's not the final census data that will be the basis for the maps, but we have census estimates, and they can be used to sort of generate draft maps, between now and the end of July. And so I think there's a lot of work that could be done, a lot of preliminary work that could be done, that would put, and again, with the sophistication, the technological and political sophistication that both parties have, I don't think it's going to take them a really long time. It won't be as quickly, obviously, as happened. I mean, in the last time around in 2011, it was a very accelerated process. The legislature acted really quickly. It got all this done in July of 2011, and that was abnormally early. So it's going to be closer to where this is normally done. It doesn't have to be done in Wisconsin. It just has to be done sort of before the 2022, nominating papers are circulated and, people file for their candidacies, and that begins to happen in the spring of 2022. So they definitely do have time.
And my final question, Craig, for this part of the program is, how much transparency can we expect in this process this time around? That was one of the complaints in the last round of redistricting. The public did not know what was going on. What can we expect this time, do you think?
I think we can expect, a bunch of maps to appear, once the census data comes out, they'll be dropped. There won't be much transparency with respect to how the legislature's redistricting plan was put together. And you'll see, the Democrats and a lot of outside groups and media outlets, do their best, quick and in-depth analysis of those maps, so people know what the political implications and the partisan implications are of the maps. And then, at that point, it becomes transparent. I mean, the maps are there for everybody to analyze, and then we have the fight over the maps.
All right, Craig, I'm going to ask you to stand by for just a moment, because we're going to bring in our Lubar Center Research Fellow, John Johnson, into the conversation. John's going to do about a 15 to 20 minute presentation, and he's been looking at the numbers and looking at how changes to the maps might or might not affect the outcome of assembly races. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Wisconsin has a confusing political personality. A casual observer, I think, might perceive it as a blue state. After all, 2016 is the only year a Democratic presidential candidate lost the state since 1984. On the other hand, it feels very purple when you consider that Barack Obama is the only presidential candidate since Michael Dukakis to win an outright majority of the vote. In still more ways, you might think this is a solidly red state. Republicans have controlled the state assembly for all but 3 years of my lifetime. Rather than encouraging a mood of bipartisanship, I think this combination of red and blue traits leads many Republicans and Democrats alike to believe that they are the true representatives of Wisconsin, who are only stymied by the illegitimate interference of the other party. My preferred description is that Wisconsin, politically speaking, is not one moderate state. Rather, it is one very conservative state overlapping another very liberal one. This state of affairs, after all, isn't new. Wisconsin gave the nation the rabid anti-communist Senator Joseph McCarthy at the same time Milwaukee elected its third mayor from the Socialist Party. The very nature of Democratic and Republican coalitions in Wisconsin, both geographically and demographically, gives each party advantages in certain kinds of elections. Republicans have long performed better in the state legislature than their statewide vote share would suggest. And this advantage accelerated after the 2011 redistricting, by some measures doubling their previous advantage. But how much of the built-in Republican advantage in the state assembly is due to deliberate partisan gerrymandering, and to what extent is it the natural consequence of Wisconsin's political geography? There's a story I often hear about Wisconsin politics that goes something like this. Wisconsin is narrowly divided between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats are more likely to win when turnout is high because they have an advantage with lower propensity voters. Even though Democrats can often win a small majority, or at least plurality of Wisconsin voters statewide, they fail to win control of the legislature because Republicans drew the map in a gerrymander so successful that Democratic success is virtually impossible. Not all of this story is borne out by the evidence. In the past, it is true, Democrats held an advantage in party identification, while Republicans were more likely to show up. Republicans could expect to do better in lower turnout elections for governor, but Democrats could count on a boost during marquee presidential races. This isn't the case anymore. From 2012 through 2016, Wisconsin Democrats enjoyed a stable 4-point advantage in party identification. But after Trump's election, that changed. Now, Republicans outnumber Democrats by 1 percentage point of the state's total electorate. This change was driven by a 13-point shift among non-college educated Wisconsin men toward the Republicans. From 2012 to 2020, the share of Republicans with at least a bachelor's degree declined from 37% to 32%. The share of Democrats with at least a bachelor's degree grew from 36% to 41%. More educated people are, of course, more likely to vote. The average Democrat is still younger and poorer than the average Republican, 2 factors which decrease the likelihood of voting. But the shift in each party's educational composition has evened the odds that each party's members will vote, particularly in gubernatorial elections. Across all 2014 polling, Republicans were 6 points more likely to be likely voters than Democrats. In 2018, they were 1 point less likely to be so than Democrats. The fact that Democratic candidates performed better in 2018 than 2020, despite 14% more of the state's eligible voters participating, may be a sign of the future. These changes in party identification have contributed to the state's increasing asymmetrical polarization. It's not that Wisconsin is splitting into half very red and half very blue places. It's that Wisconsin's Democrats are increasingly concentrated in very blue communities in a way that Republicans simply aren't. At the same time, the behavior of individual voters has become much more predictable. Consider these graphs, which compare the vote split in the presidential race with assembly races. In 2000, the assembly vote and presidential vote had a correlation coefficient of 0.61, where 1 is perfectly correlated and 0 is totally unrelated. By 2020, the coefficient reached 0.95. This political geography has serious implications for any effort to draw fair political districts. Partisan gerrymandering, as most of us know by now, works by diluting the influence of one party's votes through a combination of strategies called packing and cracking, each of which assumes that you can guess how people will vote based on where they live. Cracking is when an opposing party's voters are spread out across several districts so that they form a perpetual minority in each one. Packing is when voters from the target party are placed in as few districts as possible, limiting the number of seats they can influence. Of course, these two strategies work in tandem. You pack some voters so you can crack the rest. A large and growing number of Democrats in Wisconsin are self-packed into urban areas. Wisconsin law mandates that legislative maps avoid crossing county and municipal boundaries where practical. Federal law requires that a certain number of majority Black and majority Latino districts be drawn as well. All of this means that virtually any process of redistricting will create a set of heavily blue urban seats packed with Democrats, leaving us with the question, how much of the Democratic Party's current disadvantage in assembly races is naturally occurring and how much is due to the schemes of Republican mapmakers. Simple measures of partisan bias can be inaccurate or inconclusive. For example, we can't just compare the number of votes cast statewide for Democratic or Republican assembly candidates. Democratic candidates received 53% of total assembly votes cast in 2018, but they also contested 91 races compared to just 69 for Republicans. Over the past decade, mathematicians and quantitative social scientists have developed a set of sophisticated methods for measuring the partisan bias of maps. One popular technique is to algorithmically draw a huge number of random maps, all of which meet the criteria of being compact, contiguous, and consistent with federal civil rights requirements. Then they divide existing election data up into those hypothetical random districts. With enough of these maps, a clear distribution of normal outcomes emerges. No matter the technique used, every examination of Wisconsin's state assembly map reveals a remarkable gerrymander. A group of professors from Duke University created over 19,000 random assembly maps. They found that the Wisconsin redistricting plan is highly gerrymandered and shows more Republican bias than over 99% of the plans. Joe Y. Chen, a political scientist from the University of Michigan, performed a similar study specifically measuring the efficiency gap under alternative district schemes. Craig discussed this earlier. The efficiency gap is a measure of how many votes for one party are wasted compared to the other party. A vote is wasted if it is cast for a losing candidate or if it is cast for a candidate who already has enough votes to win their race. In a fair map, the reasoning goes close to the same number of Democratic and Republican votes will be wasted across all races. Chen's research found Wisconsin's natural political geography combined with a nonpartisan process following traditional districting principles could plausibly produce a plan with a modest amount of Republican favoring electoral bias, but critically, these levels of natural electoral bias pale in comparison to the much more extreme electoral bias exhibited by the Act 43 plan enacted by Republican legislators in 2011. The Act 43 plan exhibits a Republican favoring efficiency gap several times that of most simulated plans and over twice as large as even the most biased of the 200 plans produced by the nonpartisan computer simulation process. In other words, the existing Republican gerrymander is laughably unlikely to occur unintentionally. The simplest way to show this is just to compare the results from the districts drawn in 2011 with those used from 2002 through 2010. In 2012, Obama won 53% of the statewide vote. He won more votes than Romney in 55 of the assembly districts used in the previous decade, but he only beat Romney in 43 of the newly drawn assembly districts. There is no serious question that the state assembly districts drawn in 2011 are an extreme Republican gerrymander. However, that fact does not establish how much better Democrats could have done under a fairer map. When Republicans are already winning, the gerrymander actually has little added value. Scott Walker won 52% of the statewide vote in his 2014 reelection. This was good enough to beat Mary Burke in 64 assembly districts. He would also have beat Burke in 63 of the previous decade's districts and 62 hypothetical districts drawn to be as compact as possible. Likewise, Donald Trump's narrow victory in 2016 defeated Biden in 63 of the actual districts, 58 of the old districts, and 61 of the maximally compact districts. The gerrymander only shows its teeth when Democrats do well statewide. When Tony Evers won the statewide vote in 2018, he lost to Scott Walker in 63 assembly districts. Under the previous decade's map, Walker would have only won 53 seats. This statistic is telling for two reasons. First, it shows the strength of the 2011 gerrymander. Walker's strong 2014 performance carried 65 districts, about the same as would have occurred under the old court-drawn map. A 6-point victory or a 1-point loss statewide, as in 2014 and 2018 respectively, made practically no difference at all in the Republican Assembly majority. Second, it shows the extent to which Wisconsin's political geography stacks the deck against Democrats, even in the absence of deliberate gerrymandering. Under the old district map, Tony Evers' 1-point victory still carried 46 seats. Republicans would have still held a 7-seat majority. I broke down the results of every November presidential and gubernatorial election since 2002 into 3 assembly district schemes: the current 2011 map, the map drawn by a federal court in 2002, and a set of districts algorithmically generated to be as compact as possible. Out of all 10 of these elections, the 2012 presidential contest is the only time that majority control of the assembly varied between the schemes. Obama won 55 seats to Romney's 44 in both the 2002 and maximally compact maps. In reality, Walker carried a majority of the vote in 56 of the just drawn assembly districts. But even this split is not as clear as it seems. Obama was considerably more popular than just about any other Democrat. In 2008, he won 56% of the vote statewide, beating John McCain in 76 of the then current assembly districts. But actual Democratic candidates only won 52 of those races. We can't directly compare election results using actual votes for assembly seats because so many of these races aren't contested by both parties. 3 professors, Hirschlag and his co-authors from Duke University, offered a solution to this problem in their paper Evaluating Partisan Gerrymandering in Wisconsin. They interpolated assembly votes for wards without a contested race using a model based on votes for contested statewide and congressional elections. The results of that analysis for the 2012, 2014, and 2016 assembly elections are shown in this figure. Each histogram shows the distribution of seats won by Republicans in the ensemble of 19,184 random district maps. Republicans in 2012 actually won 60 assembly seats. This is a very extreme outcome in the Hirschlag model. Their average neutrally drawn map gave Republicans 55 seats. Based on their simulations, a map that gave Democrats a majority of the assembly in 2012 would have been just as improbable as the actual Republican gerrymander. Once again, their simulation demonstrates that the Republican gerrymander ceases to gain Republicans more seats once they win a majority statewide. In 2014, the number of seats actually won by Republicans corresponds exactly with the average result in their ensemble of nonpartisan maps. In 2016, Republicans actually won 3 fewer seats than expected because they failed to run candidates in 3 perceived safe Democratic districts, which Donald Trump unexpectedly won. The main effect of the 2011 gerrymander was to make fewer districts competitive. Even more Democrats were packed into extremely Democratic districts, and most of the remaining Democrats were strewn or cracked across a range of strongly but not absurdly Republican districts. Very few swing seats remained. If more competitive districts had remained, it's possible that Democrats would have fielded stronger candidates and funded better campaigns. This counterfactual could complicate analysis by Hirschlag. A more competitive district map might actually improve the performance of down-ballot Democrats relative to their top-of-the-ticket standard bearers. The gerrymandered map drawn in 2011 probably hasn't cost the Democrats control of the assembly in any election this decade, with the possible exception of 2012. Nonetheless, it has inflated the Republican majority in the close elections of 2012, 2018, and 2020. And in each election, it has cheated many Wisconsinites out of real competition for their votes. Under the districts drawn in 2011, only 15% of Wisconsin residents live in an assembly district that typically decides elections by single digits. If the previous map were still used, 21% would. To be honest, that gap is less than I expected. It means that even under a nonpartisan redistricting scheme, a large majority of people would still live in a non-competitive neighborhood. This points to some basic changes in Wisconsin's political geography over the last 2 decades. This image compares the neighborhoods where Democratic and Republican voters lived in the 2000 and 2020 presidential elections. The comparison is apt because each race resulted in a razor-thin Democratic victory, functionally a tie. Despite the similar statewide outcome, big things changed at the local level. The number of voters living in a closely divided neighborhood shrank. In 2000, a third of voters lived in a place decided by single digits. That fell to 23% in 2020. A greater share of Democrats now come from extremely blue neighborhoods. In 2020, 21% of Joe Biden's voters came from places where he received at least a 50-point margin of victory. Only 9% of Al Gore's voters came from such partisan places. The share of Republicans living in similarly red places only increased by 3% over this period. Still, Republicans also contributed to the rise in asymmetrical polarization. The partisan lean of the median Democratic voters' neighborhood barely budged from 2000 to 2020. The median Gore voter lived in a place where Gore won the vote by 4 points, while the median Biden voters' community gave Biden a 6-point victory. Compare that to the change in the average Republican's neighborhood. The median Bush voter in 2000 lived in a neighborhood which Bush won by 8 points. The median 2020 Trump voter's neighborhood gave him a 15-point victory. Here's another way of looking at it. In 2000, 42% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans lived in a neighborhood that the other party won. 20 years later, 43% of Democrats still live in a place that Trump won, but just 28% of Republicans lived in a Biden voting neighborhood. Today, Democrats are more likely than Republicans to live in both places where they are the overwhelming majority and places where they form a non-competitive minority. Much is at stake in Wisconsin's 2021 redistricting cycle, but whatever map-making scheme prevails, it will still fundamentally be a reflection of Wisconsin's current political geography. Many more Democrats live in extremely Democratic places than Republicans in equivalently Republican places. At the same time, the average Republican's neighborhood is much redder than the average Democrat's is blue. In combination, these two facts give Republicans a basic structural advantage that persists even in mapping schemes that focus only on the traditional criteria of contiguity and compactness. Any plausible assembly map for the 2020s would probably still create a system where Republicans would win a majority of the seats, even when Democrats win 51% of the vote statewide. But a non-gerrymandered map would increase, at least somewhat, the number of seats that either party could realistically win. A fairer map would also lower the size of the statewide victory Democrats require to win control of the assembly. Under the current boundaries, I calculate that Democrats would need to win the state by about 8.2 percentage points to win a bare majority of 50 seats. Under the maps used in the 2000s, Democrats would need a 3.8 point victory. An assembly map drawn for the 2020s without partisan consideration would likely recreate the status quo of the 2000s. A strong Democratic victory like that of Barack Obama's first campaign could likely flip control of the chamber. Anything less would still leave Republicans in control of a more narrowly divided legislature, consisting of more members with a realistic chance of losing their next election.
All right, John, thank you very much. And let's bring Craig Gilbert, the Washington bureau chief for the Journal Sentinel, back into our conversation. And Craig, you know, this is a topic you follow extensively, the redistricting process. I wonder if you have any questions for John after hearing the presentation.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one thing that's really, embedded in John's presentation is that, you know, gerrymandering right now gets a tremendous amount of its potency from two big changes in our political culture. And one, of course, is partisan polarization. You know, people aren't ticket splitting, their votes are more predictable, they're more divided along party lines. And the other is sort of the political geography, the urban-rural gap, and the way, you know, the increase he talked about in kind of like-minded communities politically. And, you know, we all know how concentrated Democrats are in cities. And we've read a lot and talked a lot about how in rural areas, you know, there's been this big red shift toward the Republican Party. So one thing I've been wondering about is when you have, you know, increasingly clustered Republican voters in rural areas, is that going to increase the number of wasted Republican votes the way, you know, the urban Democratic concentration has increased the number of wasted Democratic votes? And is that, you know, at all a challenge for the Republican map makers?
It's a really good question. That hasn't happened yet. We haven't seen enough of a shift towards the Republicans in enough places to have that sort of equivalent wasting of Republican votes there. But there are signs that we're moving that direction. If you look at a choropleth map, it seems like there's tons of hyper-Republican places, but there are often towns that have a very low population, so they don't make up a huge part of Republican coalition yet. But I think that there is an internal logic to this, where as there are fewer Democrats in those places, the Democratic Party becomes less interested in running campaigns that appeal to people in those places. And so that just sort of hastens the conversion of those parts of the state to being extremely Republican. And if enough places do become extremely Republican, while the state maintains this weird 50-50 split that we've been in for the last 20 years, that would change the calculus and make it so that a more equivalent number of Republicans are having their votes wasted, so to speak, than Democrats.
Hey, Craig, I wanted to ask you about something that was said. I actually saw it was a piece written by former state representative Fred Kessler back in November of last year. I think it appeared in the Wisconsin State Journal. And you know, his argument is that we need to draw maps differently, that some of the guiding rules no longer apply if we indeed want competition, if we think competition in districts is a good thing. He said, you know, we may have to violate the rules against crossing county and municipal lines, or we may have to bend the community of interest standard. Is that being talked about seriously in today's world? Because that he is saying essentially that given the political geography and given what John talked about and what you've talked about, it's going to be very hard to draw maps that are going to please both sides, that you're going to have to do it in a different way.
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two questions there. I think you can certainly increase competition by drawing fairer maps without going to great lengths in terms of violating compactness, just because the current plan depresses competition beyond even the natural geography of the state. So when you have a highly gerrymandered plan, I mean, you make these districts even less competitive than they normally would be. I mean, I think I counted over the course of the decade of the previous plan, I think you had about 30 assembly races total that were decided by under 3 points, and in the most recent decade under the current plan, that was about halved. Same thing with single-digit races. So the current gerrymander, makes a pretty uncompetitive landscape that much more uncompetitive. So just a fair map would remedy that a little bit, but only to a point. And Fred Kessler is right. I mean, if you really wanted to raise that level of competition, significantly, you would have to start, tying together some red districts, red communities with some blue communities. That wouldn't make everybody happy necessarily, but you'd have to go to some really creative lengths to have a highly competitive legislative landscape.
I'm wondering if each of you might weigh in on this. This is more of an opinion thing, but so I looked at you're looking, we've all looked at the numbers from the last presidential election, and you're looking at some of the changes occurring in, for example, the North Shore suburbs, which continually are becoming more and more Democratic. As we see the Republican legislature draw new maps, are those assembly districts, for example, that could be tweaked to perhaps address what they see as changes, unfavorable changes in some of those suburban areas? Craig, I'll let you start.
Yeah, so I think if you think about the shifts in the suburbs in southeastern Wisconsin, and you have sort of the Democratic strengths kind of radiating out into a broader area beyond Milwaukee County, you can imagine that, resulting in the creation of more Democratic seats. On the other hand, there's still sort of the same effect where the Democratic voters are more concentrated, because it's in the inner suburbs where the Democrats are making the bigger gains, and the outer suburbs are still pretty strong for Republicans. So a creative Republican map maker could still try to minimize the power of the Democratic shift, in these inner to middle suburbs by concentrating, packing those voters into as few districts as possible.
John, any thoughts about that possibility?
It'll be really interesting to see how the Republican legislators draw these districts, because gerrymandering, it's an exercise in political prophecy. You're trying to think, how are people going to be voting, not just in the last few elections, but in 6-8 years? I think over the last decade, the average municipality in Wisconsin changed the way it voted by about 18 points, one way or the other. So it'll be an expression not just of how people are voting now, but how those Republican legislators expect them to be voting over this decade.
Yeah,
and Mike, let me just add one thing relevant to both of these questions, and that is when you talked about competition under the old map. I can think of a number of districts in southeastern Wisconsin that were competitive only because they tied together very red and very blue areas. I mean, you had, for example, in Racine and Kenosha counties, you had state Senate districts that were very purple because they linked, blue cities in Kenosha and Racine with very Republican suburbs to the west. And you had some districts like that in Milwaukee too, which kind of linked very Democratic inner suburbs with very Republican outer suburbs. And the Republican plan looked at that and said, no, we don't like that. And they, in Racine and Kenosha, you ended up with, one Democratic district that had sort of the lakeshore cities and one Republican district that had the suburbs to the west, the very Republican suburbs. So that was a choice that Republican map makers made, where they said, forget about competition. We're going to they thought they were better off creating, more polarized districts.
Yeah, one final point on John's comment about political prophecy. You're trying to draw maps for the next decade and trying to anticipate what's going to happen. I talked to the chairman of the GOP, Andrew Hitt, the other day, and he believes that, yes, the trend that you've talked about today, that more white men without college degrees seem to be identifying now as Republicans. But the other trend, increasing Democratic votes in the suburbs, he thinks that was a temporary phenomenon, not permanent. So I think he still views the suburbs as winnable, perhaps with a different presidential candidate as an example. So I think, are they still in play? That's a great question to ask. I mean, how would you draw the map if you anticipate suburbs returning to the Republican fold, or if you anticipate them continuing to move in a Democratic direction? All interesting stuff to see play out in the coming months. I want to thank both of you today for your time and for your observations. Craig Gilbert, the Washington Bureau Chief for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. It's always good to have you with us, Craig. And John Johnson, the Lubar Center Research Fellow. Always an interesting presentation from John. Thanks to both of you, and thanks to everybody for watching today on The Issues. We'll be back with more conversations about redistricting in the coming weeks, and we'll see you then.